Captain Elias Thorne stood amidst the wreckage of the prism spire, blood dripping from a notched ceremonial blade as he stared down the syndicate leader. A knife pressed into Lyra's throat, drawing a thin line of heat. The human's voice was a low growl that cut through the whine of neural disruptors. He didn't blink. He just waited for a reason to kill. Can a predator truly be a protector? If you've ever wondered what happens when a Deathworlder meets a paradise, ask yourself, how much would you sacrifice for a loyalty you don't understand? Let's go back. That same metallic tang. Lyra had first smelled it 5 days earlier at the welcoming banquet. A faint scent of copper and old sweat that shouldn't have existed in a room filled with the fragrance of blooming star lilies. A rhythmic hiss. The hydroponic misting system in the prism gardens exhaled every 30 seconds. A mechanical heartbeat that governed the stillness of Ethelgard. For 10,000 years, this was the sound of safety. The Ethelgard did not know war, only the elegant manipulation of thought and the soft geometry of their crystal architecture. They were masters of 1,000 worlds, rulers who had traded swords for psychic symphonies. And then came the Terrans. The human delegation was small, almost an afterthought to the Archon. They were a young species from a planet the archives labeled Terra Prime, a place of crushing gravity and volatile chemistry. Lyra watched from her father's side as they entered the Great Hall. Most of them moved with the careful, apologetic grace of scholars, but one man broke the rhythm of the room. Captain Elias Thorne did not walk. He stalked. His black uniform seemed to drink the light, and his skin was a map of white scars that spoke of a violence Lyra's people had long ago evolved past. She reached out with her mind. It was a reflex, a casual dip into the thoughts of a guest to ensure the atmospheric settings were comfortable. Gone. Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her throat as the psychic feedback hit her like a physical blow. The humans were primitives, barely capable of, but then his eyes moved, and the thought died. She expected a scattered stream of simple desires. Instead, she found a cage filled with thunder and scorched iron. There was no clear narrative to Thorne's mind, only a jagged noise of survival instinct and memories of fire. It was the psychic equivalent of touching a live wire. Thorne must have felt the intrusion. He turned his head, those gray predator eyes locking onto hers with a focus that made her heart skip. He didn't look offended. He looked like he was estimating the distance to her jugular and the time it would take to bridge it. He is just human, child, Archon Valerius whispered, sensing her distress with a gentle smile. A young species that has barely learned to walk among the stars. Whatever you sensed was likely just the primitive chaos of an undeveloped mind. What could possibly be dangerous about such a creature? Lyra wanted to believe him. She tried to return to the comfort of the misting gardens, but the human's predatory stillness had stained the air. Was the Archon right, or were the Ethelgard simply too refined to recognize a wolf at the door? We'll be here to find out when the negotiations take a darker turn. The following morning, Lyra found herself drawn to the training grounds. She stayed in the shadows of the crystal pillars, watching as Thorne sat on a stone bench. He held a notched obsidian whetstone, moving it in slow, rhythmic circles against the edge of a small combat knife. The sound was a harsh, scraping counterpoint to the soft chime of the practice bells. Across the field, the Ethelgard guards were performing the dance of the Seven Veils, an ancient ceremonial drill of flowing strikes and perfect posture. Thorne watched them for an hour without saying a word. His weight stayed centered, his feet flat on the ground in a way that suggested he could spring into motion in any direction. He was a living weapon kept in a velvet box. When he finally stood to leave, Lyra caught a glimpse of his face. He wasn't impressed by the beauty of the guards' movements. He looked at them with a flash of something that felt disturbingly like pity. The banquet table was a sprawl of iridescent glass and delicate proteins. Kalen, his silk robes shimmering with every practice gesture, leaned forward with a smile that failed to mask his disdain. "Tell me, Captain," he said, his voice a melodic taunt, "is it true your people still consume the scorched flesh of other beings to survive?" The metallic tang of the nutrient broth heater rose between them, a sharp, artificial smell that underscored the sudden silence. Thorn set his glass down. He was a wolf. "We do," he said, his voice flat and heavy. "Our world didn't give us the luxury of sunlight and song. Terra Prime is a Category 12 pressure cooker where the gravity wants to crush your marrow and the oxygen in the air is a reactive poison that keeps our hearts beating at a frantic pace just to stay ahead of the things that want to eat us." Kalen's laughter died. He had felt it. The way Thorn's gaze had flicked to the knife on the table, then to Kalen's throat, then to the guards. In those 2 seconds, the human had solved a puzzle of lethal geometry. "I hope you never have to learn what survival feels like," Thorn whispered later that night, as we stood on the balcony overlooking the sleeping city. "But if that day comes, I hope you have someone standing beside you who hasn't forgotten how to fight." We were safe behind 10,000 years of. The sudden scream of a neural disruptor proved otherwise. When the Void Shatter ships broke the atmosphere, they brought a chaos that our psychic shields couldn't filter. A jagged, screaming static that tore through our collective peace and left us fumbling for weapons we hadn't touched since the dawn of our empire. The Prism Spire became a slaughterhouse in minutes. My people, gifted with the ability to sense every ripple of fear, were paralyzed by the sheer volume of agony radiating from the fallen guards. We were a species of poets being dismantled by butchers. Then Thorn moved. He didn't use psychic grace. He used momentum and bone. He snatched a ceremonial blade from a display, a relic of our brutal prehistory, and turned it into a blur of silver and red. He was an apex predator released in a room full of sheep. Every strike was a lesson in efficiency, a brutal reminder of 1,000,000 years of evolution on a world that hated him. Inside the wreckage of the spire, the air tasted like ozone and copper. Thorn didn't just wait. He leaned into the silence, his predatory eyes locked on the syndicate leader's trembling hand. The assassin thought I was a shield, but to Thorn, I was simply the last obstacle in a kill zone he had already mapped in his mind. The human stood perfectly still while blood from a shoulder wound soaked his black uniform, his breathing deep and even, as if the carnage was merely the environment he was born to inhabit. "You're afraid," Thorn said, his voice strangely gentle over the leader's ragged breathing. "I can smell the sweat, the frantic beat of a heart that knows it's already lost. You're dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet." The leader's grip faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat. It was all the Deathworlder needed. The blade left Thorn's hand, a silver streak that silenced the room forever. The leader collapsed, and I fell into arms that were surprisingly gentle for someone who had just dismantled an army. "Why?" I asked him later in the medical bay, watching a healing beam knit together the scorched skin on his shoulder. "Why fight for a people who called you a savage?" Thorn looked at me, and for once, the predator's mask was gone. "Because you were the first ones in a long time to offer us a hand instead of a cage. Humans don't forget a debt like that, princess." Weeks later, I found the notched obsidian whetstone on my nightstand, its surface worn smooth by a hand that knew only the architecture of survival. It sat in the moonlight, a heavy piece of dark earth resting against the fragile crystal of my home. I looked at the horizon, where the Terran ships now patrolled the violet sky. The stone was cold, but for the first time in 10 millennia, the silence of Ethelgard felt like a choice rather than a habit. If you want to see how this alliance changes the galaxy, join us for the next chapter of the Chronicle. We are building a future where no one has to stand alone. Until then, stay curious.